All right, I think it's time to begin and welcome, good morning, bonjour. Welcome to our fourth session of Gwillim Online. This is Lady Gwillim's Botany. Bienvenue à la quatrième présentation du projet Gwillim Virtuel. I'm Victoria Dickinson. I'm the convener of the Gwillim Project. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event. For those of you joining us for the first time, this is the fourth session in a series of 9 webinars exploring the unpublished correspondence and artwork of Lady Elizabeth Gwillim and her sister, Mary Simons. The two women moved to India in 1801 when Elizabeth's husband, Sir Henry Gwillim, was appointed a puisne judge in the Supreme Court of Madras. The Gwillim Project, Women, Environment, and Networks of Knowledge and Exchange in the Company Raj, is a research initiative of the Rare Books and Special Collections branch of the McGill Library in Montreal. It's funded through the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada and the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute, and thank you to our funders. The Blackerwood collection at McGill holds the paintings of birds, fish, and flowers by Elizabeth Gwillim, while Mary Simons' wonderful portraits and landscapes are held by the South Asia Collection Museum in Norwich. That's in the UK. The sisters' rich correspondence to family and friends is held by the British Library. The project not only brings together virtually this distributed archive, but also an international network of scholars from diverse fields in Canada, the UK, India, and the United States. A special welcome to the members of the Research Network joining us today. We would like to thank all those who have made this event possible today, in particular Dr. Anna Winterbottom, our symposia coordinator, and Lauren Williams, the Blackerwood librarian. Lauren will be watching the chat today, and if you have any problems in viewing the webinar, please send a note in the chat. This webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to view it later on YouTube. We'll be sending you a link as well as information on upcoming presentations in Gwillim Online to all who registered today. It's my pleasure now to introduce the moderator today, Minakshi Menon. Dr. Minakshi Menon is a research scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin. She's currently working on a book entitled Empiricism's Empire, Natural Knowledge Making, State Making, and Governance in East India Company, India, as well as exploring the Eurasian life of a 17th century European botanical classic, the Hortus Indicus Malabaricus. She co-chairs the Forum for the History of Science in Asia, a special interest group of the History of the Science Society. Minakshi will introduce our panelists and will be posing your questions to the speakers at the end of our presentations. Please use the chat function to ask your questions. Thank you for attending, et je vous souhaite bonne conférence. Minakshi, over to you.
Thank you, Victoria, for that very kind introduction. And bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. Good morning and welcome to McGill University's Gwillim Project Online. It is my great pleasure to introduce an old friend, Dr. Henry Noltie, as our speaker today. From 1986 to 2017, Henry Noltie worked as a curator and taxonomist at the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, of which he is now a research associate. For 14 years, he worked on the Flora of Bhutan project, of which he wrote 2 volumes. From 2000, his work was on historical aspects of the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh's herbarium and illustrations collections, especially those relating to India, which combined nomenclatural research with historical and art historical studies and the mounting of exhibitions at Inverleith House, some of which I was privileged to see. This resulted in a series of publications on Scottish East India Company surgeons and the botanical drawings they commissioned from Indian artists in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The last of these Indian monographs consisted of 3 volumes on the collections of Hugh Cleghorn, a pioneering forest conservator and the source of one of the largest groups of botanical drawings and many important books in the RBGE collection. Over the last 2 years, Henry has spent much time at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, of which he is also a research associate. Henry's work at Kew was initially directed towards the exhibition Forgotten Masters, recently held at the Wallace Collection in London, but has now resulted in the cataloguing of more than 5,000 botanical drawings made by Indian artists for East India Company patrons, including Francis Buchanan Hamilton, John Forbes Royal, Hugh Falconer, and Nathaniel Wallach. Henry's paper will be commented upon by Dr. John Bosco Lourdusamy, a historian of science and technology and associate professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, in India. His expertise lies in the history of science, technology, and medicine in colonial India. His current areas of research include the global circulation of crops, the global flows of botanical knowledge, and the rise of plantation economies. He is part of the Moving Crops working group at the Max Planck Institute here in Berlin and is engaged in a joint book project with the other members of the group on moving crops. Before handing you over to Henry, a few words on the importance of his paper for those of us interested in recovering the history of the study of botany by European women in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Elizabeth Gwillim's botanical studies, Henry remarks, were spurred by her Orientalist interests. She learned Telugu, a South Indian language, and in a revealing passage in one of her letters, declares that studying botany is vital if one is to understand literary references in the language. The famous Orientalist, William Jones, paid careful attention to the botanical references in the Sanskrit verse lexicon, the Amarakosha, for similar reasons, although he also used his knowledge of Sanskrit names of plants to interrogate Linnaean nomenclature. We do not know whether Elizabeth Gwillim was proficient in the Linnaean sexual system. Her drawing of Gwillimia indica does not show a dissection of plant parts. But she was tutored in botany by Johann Peter Rottler of the Danish mission in Tranquebar, that is today's Tarangambadi, must have acquainted her with the work of Linnaeus. She may not have been the talented Linnaean botanist that Anna Maria Jones was. Lady Jones was able to escape her solicitous husband's grasp and develop that thorough understanding of Linnaean botany that 18th century British men feared would corrupt their wives and sisters and daughters. And in this connection, I should mention that Anne Stair of York University in Toronto published a monograph in 1996, which is well worth reading. Titled Cultivating Women, Cultivating Science, Flora's Daughters and Botany in England, 1760 to 1860, it examines how an emerging tension in the gender identity of botany and botanists in the Georgian and early Victorian periods turned botany into a male scientific pursuit as it simultaneously limited women's botanical studies to a polite accomplishment. One result of this was the minimization of women's contributions to botany in the 18th and 19th centuries in the social history of science, which is one of my areas of expertise. Lady Gwillim was obviously much more than a practitioner of the sort of polite botany that was deemed sufficient for the upper class women of her time. Henry's paper offers tantalizing glimpses of the botanical activities of a woman whose life and work I hope will be studied in depth. It also leads us to ask whether the colonial milieu enabled women such as Elizabeth Gwillim and Anna Maria Jones to escape the constraints sometimes imposed on their metropolitan sisters as they sought to study the botanical science of their time. Thank you. And now, over to you, Henry.
Thank you very much, Minnie. Can you hear me? I shall begin my talk now. In a letter of 1803, Mary Simmons conjured up a remarkable scene of the botanical activities of her sister, Elizabeth Lady Gwillim, who was in her glory, that is, with about 20 black men around her, a table full of books, the floor strewn with baskets of seeded branches of trees. The seeds and plants are collected from the hills and woods by some poor country people, and she gets some of the native doctors to give her the common name. The Brahmins tell her the Sanskrit, and the books are consulted to find out the Linnaean names, so that with collecting plants, raising them in our garden, studying the language and names of this country, and now and then drawing, we continue, thank God, to amuse ourselves without being indebted to the society of this place, which is stupid enough in all conscience. This quotation is deeply revealing about the sisters, their passionate natures and inquiring minds that set them apart from most of the expat community of Madras. A particular note is the multiculturalism, the determination to use local sources of information. The sisters' letters are remarkable documents revealing their respect for and fascination with Indian life in its rich diversity. Also revealed here are interests developed before they reached Madras. Both were skilled artists. Mary largely drew people and places, Elizabeth birds and botany. Both were interested in gardening and the exchange of ornamental and useful plants. Although the quotation reveals their awareness of European scientific literature, Elizabeth explains in one of her letters the real reason for her wanting to study botany in India. She said, "Without some little knowledge of botany, it is impossible to read the Hindu language. Their allusions to particular plants which are essential to their different ceremonies are so pointed that unless you know the plants, which botany alone can teach you, the merit of the whole passage is lost." This would have gladdened the heart of Sir William Jones, who shared this motivation for his Indian botanical studies, but it's hard to overemphasize what an unusual source of inspiration it was for an upper middle class European woman. The usual route to the pursuit of botanical studies in India lay ultimately with medicine, and while not a motivation for her own botanical interests, Elizabeth was aware of indigenous interest in medicinal plants. She wrote, "They have many excellent medicines amongst their vegetables, which they apply frequently with great success. And indeed, there is a knowledge of plants, even amongst the lowest of people, that shows a great attention to the productions of nature." At this same time, the Scottish Company surgeon Whitelaw Ainslie was codifying such indigenous knowledge in his Materia Medica of Hindustan, in which he was assisted botanically by Johann Peter Rottler, dedicatee of the volume, to whom I'll return. A generation earlier, another company surgeon, William Roxburgh, had extended botanical inquiry into an encyclopedic documentation of all plants, medicinal and otherwise. And in the Gwillim era, Roxburgh's colleague, Francis Buchanan Hamilton, developed into a fine art the methods of statistical survey, the documentation of natural resources, including botanical, of potential benefit to mankind, but especially to the coffers of the East India Company and its shareholders. In the wake of Tipu's defeat in 1799, a survey of the newly acquired Mysore territories was in progress under Colin Mackenzie, with Benjamin Heine as botanist, which was commissioned by Lord Edward Clive, the Governor of Madras and a Gwillim acquaintance. Buchanan's rapid survey of the same area, commissioned by the Governor-General, Lord Wellesley, had been completed in 1801, so the Gwillims tantalisingly missed meeting him in Madras by only a few weeks. From their first letters, the sisters' delight in Indian flora is apparent, both in its natural state and what was visible in the highly cultivated coastal plain around Madras, as was modified by man. They wrote, "The trees are large and tall, and the whole place is like parks and gardens with every beauty that can be in a flat country. This can be seen in the backgrounds of the paintings of the houses they occupied at St. Thomé and St. Thomas's Mount, and on William Webb's cotton farm at Pamell. Of agricultural plants, it was not only European crops, fruits and culinary herbs that they described, but unfamiliar indigenous ones, wild legumes, yams, sweet potatoes, greens and sorrels, and various squashes and gourds. Elizabeth noted the coconut groves and fields of rice and millet. There were also exotic fruits, especially mangoes, of which there are as many varieties as apples. Elizabeth also described the plants used for hedging: wild sugarcane, prickly pear, bamboo, American aloes, and a kind of breadfruit. Also of interest were the ornamental flowers, fragrant tube roses in gardens, and oleander as used in a religious ceremony. Elizabeth noted the interest taken in by Indians in plants and the differences between their views and those of the Europeans. She wrote, "Indeed, the study of plants would have been esteemed highly by the natives, though they would have studied different from ours, at least our modern modes. Such respect have they for vegetable tribes that many of the more useful plants are venerated like divinities, but their books of description are exactly in the style of Culpeper, the 17th century English herbalist, and a plant is seldom selected as a remedy for any natural quality, but for the influence that some planet is supposed to have over it." In January, at the end of the winter monsoon, came the great gardening time. The Gwillims gardened at their main residence, Madras Gardens, at St. Thomé, but they also spent periods at St. Thomas's Mount in a house rented from an Armenian, where Elizabeth sowed seeds according to orders provided by Dr. Anderson. The sisters, especially Mary, also wrote vivid descriptions of the social uses to which Indians applied botany, including as decorations, both architectural and personal. In one of her remarkable ethnographic paintings, titled "Scene from a Sanskrit Drama," Mary depicts one such use as flower garlands. Flowers such as double jasmine were threaded together to form wreaths and garlands as adornments not only for humans, including the palanquin boys, but for horses. Of particular interest is one of Elizabeth's hedging plants, her wild breadfruit. This is Pandanus tectorius, also known as Pandanus odoratissimus, of which Mary painted an exceptionally large specimen. Its cream-coloured male inflorescences are scented like a musk flower, which Elizabeth described as being plaited into women's hair and falling down their backs. As the wife of a judge, Elizabeth had social duties to perform, and one such interaction, that with the governor, here shown with his wife and two girls, overlapped with her horticultural interests. The Gwillims entertained Lord Clive to dinner and attended balls that he gave at Government House on the left here, such as one in October 1802 to celebrate the opening of the banqueting house, seen on the right here, which was built to commemorate the defeat of Tipu. This interaction would have been greater had the governor's wife, Lady Henrietta Clive, left Madras 3 months before the Gwillims arrived. This sparkling Welsh aristocrat was only too well aware, as were the inhabitants of Madras and the Governor-General, that her husband's abilities were strictly limited. And in 1799, Wellesley had felt it necessary to travel to Madras to direct the military campaign against Tipu. Clive seems meekly to have taken refuge in his garden. As Mary put it, the present Lord Clive is a very good-natured man, but in the affairs of the government, he is a mere child and knows no more what he is doing than I do. He's extremely fond of gardening, and the natives, who have a good deal of humour, call him Gardener Maestri, just as the people at home call the king Farmer George. This garden was probably pursued in the grounds both of the palatial government house to the south of Fort St. George and at the Governor's Garden House at Guindy. Specimens from these gardens have survived, as shown here, collected in 1804 by Rottler. Previous year, Elizabeth had sent seeds to Lord Clive from the garden at the Mount. The Simon sisters seem never to have strayed far from the environs of Madras, whereas Henrietta Clive, with a vast entourage, had made an intrepid 1,100-mile tour of southern India between March and October 1800. The visual records of this will be discussed later, but during its course, the party visited several places of botanical interest and met both Rottler and Heine, two of the botanists shortly to interact with the Gwillims. Elizabeth must have been told of Henrietta's interests and regretted not meeting her. Wrote, "It was a disappointment Lady Clive and her two daughters left this place, as they were fine and agreeable. She delighted in this country and made large collections of curiosities, which indeed any person might easily get, but there is a great difficulty in preserving them from the ants. The reference to collections and the difficulty of their preservation may explain why Elizabeth and Mary concentrated on making visual records of naturalia. There's no evidence that they made a herbarium. By far the most frequent botanical references in the letters concern the exchange of seeds and plants with the sisters' English correspondence. This came about through their friendship with Reginald Whitley and the Thoburn sisters Elizabeth and Mary, who in 1791 became Whitley's stepdaughters. After their father's death in 1790, Whitley married Peter Thoburn's widow and ran the nursery at Old Brompton in London with its succession of partners. From 1801 to 1810, this was with Peter Brames. As will be seen, one of the plants Elizabeth was most anxious to establish was a Gwillimia indica. And in March 1805 is mention of small boxes with sandalwood trees. It's hard to say what came of the innumerable bags of seeds that she sent to Whitley. Two species did, however, succeed and made it into the Botanical magazine. The snake gourd on the left here, introduced via Whitley and Brames, illustrated as Trichosanthes anguina in February 1804, and in December 1805 came the Syringapatam hollyhock under the name Althea flexuosa. By the time the sisters arrived in October 1801, Madras had been a fertile ground for the study of Indian botany for a century, with Fort St. George the cradle for investigations by British surgeon botanists since the 1690s. An evocative link between these two periods can be experienced today. On entering the St. Mary's Church in the fort, inset into the pavement is the black gravestone of Elizabeth, seen on the right, while in the graveyard behind and to one's left is the brown stone of the surgeon botanist Samuel Brown, who died in 1698. The focus for botanical investigation then moved south to the Danish colony of Tranquebar, where the most active botanically of several missionary establishments was the one run from Halle, to which Rottler went in 1776. There was also a Moravian one with its own garden, and one of its doctors, Benjamin Heine, also figures in the Gwillim story. Despite sectarian rivalries, the botanists collaborated, and specimens from all of them were in the herbarium assembled by Rottler. In the meantime, the British, especially the Scots, had entered the picture of botanical exploration. In 1778, a post of naturalist or botanist was created on the Madras establishment, of which Patrick Russell and Roxburgh were the second and third holders, and to which Heine was appointed in 1802. Lady Gwillim's closest botanical contact was with Rottler. He trained in Germany in Copenhagen and went to Tranquebar as a missionary. He botanized with colleagues and supervised the missionary garden. He sent many specimens back to European botanists, especially to Carl Ludwig Wildenhoff in Berlin, who published many species based on Tranquebar material in his fourth edition of Linnaeus' Species Plantarum. He also published an account of an excursion made by Rottler from Tranquebar to Madras in the autumn and winter of 1799, during which he met Dr. James Anderson and Andrew Berry and collected specimens like these ones in their gardens. In 1803, Rottler was invited as a missionary to the Vepari mission of the British SPCK in a western suburb of Madras. Disputes in and between Danish and British missionary societies meant this posting was short-lived, but Rottler remained in Madras as chaplain of the female orphan asylum. He later returned to Veperi, where he supervised the building of St. Matthias Church, and it was here that he died in 1836 at the great age of 86. A monument in the church by Richard Westmacott shows Rottler expanding his Tamil translation of the New Testament to an Indian convert who sits beneath a banana plant. As I've explained, Elizabeth was keen to learn botany for cultural and literary reasons, but this led to something unusual for a woman of her status and position in India, the seeking of formal tuition. In Rottler, as a Tamil scholar with German botanical links, she found someone in a unique position to help her with both Indian and European botany. Her once or twice weekly lessons are first reported in October 1804 and were still taking place the following March. This interaction led to Rottler's desire to commemorate his patron pupil in what he believed to be a new genus, a flowering shrub from Java that she encountered in the St. Thomas's Mount garden. On the 24th of August 1805, Elizabeth wrote, "I have drawn the plant Dr. Rottler has done me the honour to call Gwillimia indica. I have given one drawing to Dr. Rottler. It came from Batavia and is there called Sampa solaca, which means milk flower. It is very much like a magnolia plant. I rather think that Dr. Rottler wants this drawing sent to Dr. Smith with the dried specimen." In the Botanical magazine in 1806, John Sims illustrated a specimen of Magnolia pumila that had originated in China. Having probably seen Smith's drawing and specimen, he clearly suspected it to be the same as Gwillimia, but he paid credit to Rottler's protege while leaving room for some taxonomic doubt. Sims wrote, "We have been informed that some botanists in Madras named it Gwillimia in honour of the patroness of science in that presidency, but as it cannot be separated from Magnolia, we do not feel ourselves at liberty to adopt the alteration, though desirous of paying every respect to this amiable lady." Magnolia pumila had been described by Henry Andrews in 1802, but in fact the plant had an earlier name, Magnolia coco, coined in 1790 by Loureiro, based on plants from China and Vietnam, which is therefore the correct name for Gwillimia indica. Elizabeth's exquisite watercolour is still in Smith's herbarium at the Linnean Society in London, with her herbarium specimen and Rottler's covering letter. It's her only finished botanical drawing to have survived, a fine example of 18th century botanical painting in the Florilegium tradition of Ehret. On the back is a tiny annotation in Telugu script at the top here. I WhatsApped this to a colleague in Madras whose response was that it read, "Sumpa sa la ka." These are the letters, no meaning. But they do have meaning. The stalked champak, according to Subbu Subramanya. Nothing to do with the milk flower that Elizabeth had said was its name in Batavia. This must have been supplied by one of her Indian gardeners, who correctly realised its affinity with the native champak. As I've said, Rottler amassed a large herbarium, including specimens collected by himself, other missionaries, and Heine. This was bequeathed to the Veperi mission and donated by the SPCK to King's College, London, who in 1872 gave the collection to Kew. While at King's, many of the Rottler specimens were incorporated into the herbarium of the college's Professor of Materia Medica, John Forbes Royal, and these specimens, such as the one on the left, are now in the World Museum at Liverpool. The second of Elizabeth Gwillim's German naturalists in Madras was Benjamin Heine, who arrived at Tranquebar in 1792. The following year, he transferred to the East India Company and replaced Roxburgh at the experimental garden at Samalcotta. And as I've said, from 1799 to 1802, was the botanist on Mackenzie's Mysore survey. Though he collected botanical specimens and commissioned an Indian artist to paint plants and birds, these are two of them made in Mysore, his main interest was in geology and mineralogy. During Gwillim's time as Madras naturalist, Heine was based in the Botanical Garden in Bangalore, to which the Samalcotta plants have been relocated. In August 1805, Elizabeth wrote of Heine, he is very good-natured and sends me baskets of little apples from Bangalore and lately a large basket of potatoes, which they're trying to cultivate in the Mysore. After Rockler, Lady Gwillim's most significant naturalist contact in Madras was with Dr. James Anderson, a Scottish company surgeon and since 1786 physician general. He was especially interested in the development of plant resources in agriculture, particularly the establishment of a silk industry and the introduction of the cochineal insect. In 1778, he acquired an 87-acre plot to the west of Madras, which he developed as a private botanical garden that was visited by a party of Elizabeth's friends in August 1805. Anderson also gave her medical advice, and when her nerves proved problematic in March 1804, he ordered her to the Mount, which she described as being high ground is like the Hampstead of Madras. In 1789, Anderson had persuaded the Madras government to allow him to set up a nopalry or cactus garden. Nopal's the Mexican-Spanish name for the prickly pear, the host of cochineal insect. This was with the hope of breaking the Spanish monopoly over the red dye. The garden, this is a slightly later house on the same site, was put under the charge of Anderson's nephew, Dr. Andrew Berry, another company surgeon, and it was doubtless here in February 1802 that Elizabeth drew the cochineal insect and plants. We don't have her drawings, unfortunately, and this pair were made for Roxburgh on the right and Robert White on the left. Despite huge effort, the experiment was unsuccessful, though the cactus did prove useful as an anti-scorbutic. When Anderson died in Madras in 1809, 2 handsome memorials were raised to his memory. In St. George's Cathedral is a fantastic life-size sculpture by Francis Chantry, which shows Anderson seated with a herbarium specimen of Nepenthe on his lap. And in the island cemetery stands his handsome mausoleum, his name inscribed on the 4 semicircular pediments in Telugu, Tamil, Persian and English. Sadly, it's being split apart by a peepal tree and won't last much longer. As with botanical exploration, the Madras in which the Gwillims found themselves also had a history in terms of the illustration of natural history subjects. As far back as 1700, Edward Berkeley had commissioned paintings of birds from an Indian artist. The earliest botanical drawings commissioned by a European patron on the Coromandel coast were probably those made for Roxburgh from the 1780s onwards. Roxburgh's artists may have started as chintz painters, and it's interesting to note that 20 years later, Elizabeth described the work of such men, painting palimpores in San Tome. She wrote, "One person draws all the outline and others put in the colours. They will come to your house and paint you any pattern you like on a sheet of what cloth you choose to give them." As I've said, Heine also employed Indian artists to illustrate plants, and given his Tranquebar background, it's possible that his artists were of the Tanjore school. These were Telugu-speaking artists associated with the nearby court of Tanjore and its ruler Safoji. They also worked in Trichinopoli and were known to British patrons as Muchis. For Safoji and for European patrons, these artists would learn to paint plants and birds in a more westernized style, but in this volume of around 1790, cereals and pulses painted and also mounted and bound in a more traditional Indian style. The Gwillims must have been aware of this Indian painting tradition, as concerning the copy of Mary's fish drawings is a reference to a native artist. Dr. Anderson has entreated that she will let a native copy them before they go home, that they may not be entirely lost when an accident happen. In Madras, there also existed what might be termed a European amateur tradition of botanical painting, to which Elizabeth herself belonged. Between 1783 and 1791, Thomas Joseph Reichel, an Austrian baron, worked as a draftsman for the Corps of Engineers and made exceptional watercolours of plants, similar in style to Elizabeth's Magnolia, some of which survive in the Natural History Museum in London. Closer to Elizabeth in terms of gender and social background are the botanical drawings associated with Henrietta Clive. I've mentioned her tour of southern India, on which she took her daughters Harriet and Charlotte, and the Italian artist and governess Anna Tonelli. In a project similar to that of Mary Simmons, Tonelli made visual records of the people, places and plants encountered. Some of the original watercolours survive in 2 early 20th century scrapbooks owned by Harriet's descendants, as well as professional botanical drawings by Tonelli, such as this superb Passiflora, are charming drawings by the 2 girls made when they were only 14 or 15. These provide contemporary illustrations of some of the Indian species mentioned in the Gwillim letters, including the oleander and mango seen on this right-hand page, and tamarind and sandalwood. It's unfortunate that as yet only one of Elizabeth Gwillim's finished botanical paintings has come to light, the Magnolia. In the McGill collection is a 10-page album bearing a dozen botanical sketches that, in the absence of the Magnolia, would have given a very unfair impression of her skill in this genre, but these must have been made in England before her departure from India. I probably by now overstretched your collective Zoom attention spans, for which I apologise, so I'll end here. More could be said about Lady Gwillim's Botany, some of which is outlined in the longer paper from which I've extracted this talk, but hopefully this has at least given you a taste of the botanical riches contained in the letters and some historical context to the work, both written and visual, that she undertook in her sadly curtailed days in Madras. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. That was absolutely fascinating. And John, now it's over to you for your comments.
Thank you, Minakshi, and thank you, Victoria, Lauren, Anna, and everyone who has made this possible. Before I go on to respond to Henry's paper, which is basically reading out another paper which is in front of me, I wish to point out to a bit of history behind me. Probably it's much after sunset now, but not much is visible, but this is part of the governor's garden that Henry referred to. This is in Guindy, and this is where IIT is located now, and it's very likely that some of the characters that Henry mentioned have walked and talked in the ground down behind me here. So now, what basically I wish to do in response to Henry's paper comprises of 3 parts. One is to situate Henry's elaborate exposition of Lady Gwillim's botany in broader international and historical currents. Secondly, I wish to offer a few of my own reflections on Lady Gwillim's botany. And finally, I'd focus on some of the important transformations in the world of botany at large after the 1830s, but in order to situate Lady Gwillim's botany retrospectively from that subsequent time frame. For the benefit of the wider audience who are joined here with us today, I wish to lay out what botanizing meant in the period we are discussing today. That is the post-Enlightened era, around 18th century. Given the Enlightenment spirit of understanding nature in all its fullness and infused both with a sense of joy and discovery and the ideal of improvement, botany was one of the most popular and fashionable activities. It was particularly seen as an elite learned endeavor, especially among the aristocratic classes. This pursuit, with a commingling of high taste, luxury, and erudition, did not, however, necessarily mean a rigorous academic and professional stance. Most practitioners were amateur, yet connoisseurs in their own different ways, and they were sustained by various impulses ranging from the love of nature, the natural theology bent, attraction towards the simplicity of the Linnaean model of classifying and systematizing nature in all its nature and beauty. Botanizing at this time would encompass a combination of a few or all of the following: planting, of course, collection of materials such as seeds, plants, or parts of plants, preservation of plant materials such as in herbaria, drawing and paintings of them, observations made by oneself, and gathering of knowledge from other sources locally and from different corners of the globe, and writing, and then finally, exchange of material, which in turn involves some of the above. It could be exchange of plants and seeds, preserved herbarium, specimens, paintings, writings, and gathered or observed knowledge. All the above in turn meant communion with a variety of personnel like fellow garden keepers, missionaries, physicians, botanists, collectors, indigenous peoples of various kinds, and also with institutions like the Linnaean Society and the Royal Society. One of the outstanding elements in all this was the cult of the exotic, the search for and the desire to possess and to study and to exhibit or even flaunt the exotic in public places and in private households and social events. This element is of particular significance in relation to the extra-European world and the process of colonialism and imperialism, as a very understanding of the exotic, that is exotic to the Western world, and the procurement of the exotic were all implicated in these processes. Also to be highlighted in the context of our discussion today is the place of women in all this. Women, especially from upper classes and aristocratic background, played a very prominent role in not only cultivating gardens, but also collecting exotics and in socializing to the world of botany. Also, they wrote popular books on botany and taught their children at home from early years about plants. But in the process, botany itself came to be gendered and tended to be coded as feminine. This in turn invited particular forms of reaction in the 1830s, which we will come to in the third part. There are also outstanding names which could be linked to these processes, like Joseph Banks, who was a kind of a botanical emperor who presided over many of the above processes on the global stage from his high throne at the Kew Gardens, London, and also the Royal Society as its president for many years. One particular name to be highlighted is that of Sir James Edward Smith, to whom we saw in Henry's paper, Lady Gwillim had sent a specimen. Smith was someone who zealously perpetrated the cult of botany and of the exotic throughout his life. Not a professionally trained botanist, but someone who botanized so fervently and went on to become the founder and president of the Linnaean Society. Also through his works like exotic botany, he was like a lighthouse for those who botanized in different roles with different goals. And what would result from all of the above was a range of possibilities, some of which would also count as motivating factors. Simple joy and pleasure, cultured leisure, knowledge of crops, movement of crops, medicinal knowledge and benefits, and finally, general knowledge about related places beyond the knowledge of the crops and the methods of their growing and their immediate uses in such places. Most importantly, especially where alien localities were involved in the process of generation and transfer of plants and knowledge, a whole lot of other processes also happened, such as decontextualization of the artifact or the knowledge, erasure of cultural associations and meanings, and the denial of agency of the local participants, contributors, and informants. Thus, botany, and at a fundamental level, even gardening can be a highly political act, going beyond just pleasure, leisure, learning, adornment, utility, and commerce. Moving on now to our second part, Henry has shown how Lady Gwillim and her sister's works had encompassed almost all components of what botanizing meant, as I listed out earlier. Of course, they raised their own gardens, planting, they collected materials, they preserved, and of course here they had some difficulty in preservation, and that's why they chose to concentrate on visual records. Of course, on one occasion, as was pointed out, they sent dry specimen to the very same James Smith referred to above. So they did drawing, they did observations, they gathered knowledge, and as we learned, they were determined to use all levels of knowledge from locus planters to Indian doctors and learned Brahmins with access to science literature. And of course, writing they did the apocryphal letters and exchange, apart from sharing knowledge through their letters and exchange of ornamental useful plants, they were also instrumental in the transfer, two known cases of transfer of plants, thus in their own little way contributing to the cult of the exotic back home. One should not miss the irony here that on the one hand, while her kin back home were longing for and experimenting with the exotic in the temperate climate, Gwillim's fellow expatriates before and after her time here in India were painstakingly trying to cultivate European plants, driven by various factors like nostalgia and longing for home and its visual delights, and to consume familiar fruits and vegetables. They did this with varying degrees of success on the plains or going to higher elevations of a small kind like St. Thomas Mount right here, or much farther away and higher like the Nilgiris Hills. While the sisters Elizabeth Gwillim and Mary Simons were considerably part of the botanical exchange fraternity, both locally and internationally, it would be interesting to look at their motives, especially in the light of those who botanized around them and with whom they had connections. Many of those who were zealously part of the circle, especially in the so-called peripheries, competed for the commercial and diplomatic wealth that could be amassed by the accumulation of specimens, and in the local context of the East India Company servants, these were in search of such rewards like preferment within official hierarchy of the East India Company and patronage from informal social circles that underlay it, as beautifully explicated by Anna Winterbottom. The sisters seem to stand out from such others in their immediate network in that they seem to be less instrumental, at least in terms of personal advancement, which of course also had to do with their position here as equivalent to the aristocracy back home by being part of the ruling elite here belonging to the family of a learned judge. Of course, they would have expected and did indeed get relevant returns and favors, apart from plants, seeds, and advice on them, also books, as in the process of comparison of plants from around the world, printed books were important aids in botanizing, in locating one's collections in the wider distribution of plants, and also in looking out for more possibilities to collect. The sisters seem to be less instrumental from a different point of view as well, in that they were more part of socialized botany than commissioned botany. That is the kind of works undertaken as part of larger surveys by men like Francis Buchanan and Mackenzie and others who were not only commissioned specifically by the East India Company with largely instrumental goals, but also trained with a particular emphasis on the improvement and civilizing ideal, say by stalwarts like Reverend John Walker in places like Edinburgh, as explicated by our moderator Minakshi Menon in one of her recent pieces. Yet the sisters' works intersected directly or indirectly with the imperial network, both in their life and after their death, as some of their specimens did get sent during their lifetime or reach places like Kew Gardens or other repositories, which were very much part of imperial botanizing. But if not deriving direct instrumental benefit from the linkages, the sisters delighted in being given some elbow room and recognition in that imperial network, as when Lady Gwillim blushes at the compliment paid to her by Dr. Sims in London for her delineation of subjects of natural history with delicacy and accuracy. While thinking of motives, it is fascinating to note that, among other things, one of the important reasons for Lady Gwillim to turn to botany was to learn the local language, Telugu. As she says on many occasions, when she read passages in local languages, she was unable to appreciate the full merit of some of them due to the reference of some plant, flower, or the other. This, quite interestingly, is the exact opposite of the case of many Orientalists or surgeons and scholars who learned local languages in order to understand or tap the medical, botanical, or other treasures in indigenous literature. It is also interesting that, unlike in many other cases, medicine was not a main motivation or the root for her own botanical interests. The confession by Lady Gwillim about the linguistic root also speaks to the vibrant presence of botany in the lived lives of the local population in terms of medical, cultural, and other circumstances, and also about its dominant place in the local language and literature. While Lady Gwillim's botanizing was part of a larger social, cultural, and linguistic learning project, in the learning and dissemination of some of it, she also becomes complicit in some of the discursive tendencies in botanizing I mentioned earlier, and also in some of the Orientalist tropes, such as decontextualization, erasure, and denial of agency to the local informants. In botanical drawing, Lady Gwillim clearly ensconces herself in that tradition of the emerging Enlightenment demand that plants or parts of them be depicted shorn of the ecology and the culture to which they belonged. Also, in spite of learning local language and obtaining local names, we see a condescending and dismissive attitude towards local participants. Even when they are mentioned as informants, as in the very first quotation in Henry's paper, in the very process of Lady Gwillim's gathering of the specimen and the knowledge, the dispensers become indispensable. A magical vanishing act is performed and agencies collapse, as when the sister writes, without being indebted to the society in this place. Lady Gwillim also seems to share the trend seen among some Orientalists and contemporary physicians, while acknowledging local knowledge, yet pointing to what some of them termed as crude or dark empiricism. That is, the locals seem to have fruitful practices or efficacious cures, but without knowing about the underlying theories or concepts, as when she writes about many excellent medicines amongst the vegetables, which they apply frequently with great success. And indeed, there is a knowledge of plants, even among the lowest of people, that shows a great attention to the productions of nature, although they have formed no notion how the qualities of vegetable act on the body. Also, Lady Gwillim very keenly highlights Western methods as distinct and different from the local, which is seen to be too much tied to religion and rituals. But I believe that there are other letters which speak more and better about the locals and their works. Even in today's paper by Henry, we had reference to the garden workers and how they regard garden produce as their own to sell and yield only small amounts to the family, etc. I hope when the large store of the letters are published, some of that local flavor will be retained. I say this particularly keeping in mind instances like that of Captain James Cook, who in his voyage journals, in spite of his own lack of formal botanical training, noted the local specificities in great and personal detail. But subsequently, when it came to publishing, much of that was toned down owing to the demand of the Enlightenment spirit to shear away as much of the observing subject and the subjective senses. Also instrumental was Cook's own anxiety about earning a desirable audience from the polite and gentlemanly world, and also the involvement of people from that world who aided him in preparing the work for publication. I'm sure, and like that, Gwillim letters will, in all their richness, unveil to the world whatever of the local flavor and labor is captured in them. In the third part, let us move on to a time after Lady Gwillim's death, but not too far. By the 1820s and 30s, the picture of botanizing that I presented at the beginning came under severe strain, marked by a call and a move away from the realm of the amateur, aristocratic, elite, and feminine moorings. The feminization that I mentioned earlier was one of the core issues in this reformulation. By this time, a new social map of science was being drawn in England, and new disciplinary boundaries of natural knowledge were established, with periodicals carrying reports from subject-based groups, including astronomical, chemical, entomological, geographical, geological, horticultural, statistical, and zoological societies, marking a growing bifurcation in science between the generalists and the specialists, the popular and the academic. In the process, activities within scientific culture that were associated with politeness and gentility were increasingly rejected, and utilitarian culture was on the ascendant. And these are points that are beautifully explicated by Anne Steyer, to whom Minakshi referred to in the introduction. Polite learning, including botany, was seen to be closely associated with women's pursuits and leisured upper class, and stood in need of academic rigor, of formal training, and discipline-based specialization. Serious botany was henceforth to be the prerogative of scientific institutions, largely, if not entirely, restricted to men. This assault was led by John Linley, the first professor of botany at University College London, someone who was termed as a prodigiously energetic figure, who wrote voluminously about plants for audiences at various levels, and who dedicated himself to putting botany on a new footing by cultivating interest in it as a science. It was a star coincidence that Linley was appointed professor of botany the very year that James Smith died. Also dead by this time was Sir Joseph Banks, who, as president of the Royal Society, had dictated the terms under which botany had been studied in Britain for nearly 40 years, and also embodied the whole world of polite, gentlemanly science. It has to be noted that the London University itself was just established around the time, 1826, 3 years before Linley assumed the professorship. The university was started with the modernizing ethos, primarily as a reaction to Oxford and Cambridge, and thus termed by some as a godless college, representing all that was radical, secular, and commercial in imperial London, and repudiating the aristocratic ideals and polite knowledge, and seeking to turn middle-class students into a professional elite. Linley launched his purging mission in his very inaugural address on 30th April 1829, when he unequivocally declared that the science of botany should be about plant structure rather than identification and classification. He wanted botany to be redeemed from cultural connections between women and class-marked culture of polite accomplishment, complaining that it has been very much the fashion of late years in this country to undervalue the importance of this science and to consider it as amusement for ladies rather than as an occupation for serious thoughts of man. In fact, the prospectus for one of Linley's courses condemned almost all botanical works published before the 19th century, and particularly requested students not to furnish themselves with any introductory mark by the late Sir James Edward Smith. This for us, in the end, leaves one, perhaps an unkind question. Was Lady Gwillim's botany the expatriate variant of what Linley was attacking at home? Bringing the issues closer to our times, one can perhaps pose another question too. In spite of the much better position of women, thanks to many improvements, reform measures, etc., still are not the implications of feminization and masculinization of the bygone times of the 1800s and 1900s echoing in some corners of the world of science and engineering, refusing to die and showing occasionally themselves in ugly ways. But for today, we'll get back and stick to Lady Gwillim and her brand of botany. Thank you. Thank you for your patience and attention. Over to you, Minakshi.
Thank you, John, for those perspicuous comments about the political and social context of Henry's paper. I'm sure you've given everyone a great deal to think about, and I hope we're going to see all that thinking in the questions you're going to ask Henry and John. So we move on now to the question and answer section of today's program. And I would ask you to send me your comments written down in the chat section, and I will call upon you in turn. Right, so let's go. Thank you, and yes, here we go. So here's the we've got 3 questions, one after the other, and I think they are from the Gwillim Project and one specifically from Victoria Dickinson. Here's the first one. It's a question for Henry. It says, "Thank you for this fascinating paper. Can you discuss in some more detail Elizabeth's botanical networks in England? How were specimens transported between Madras and England?" So a question with 2 parts, Henry.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we don't really know terribly much about Elizabeth's networks other than the ones that are mentioned in the letters. Clearly, it was mainly with the Whitley and Thoburn families over the transport of seeds. The link with James Edward Smith was not direct, nor was the one with John Sims, the editor of the Botanical magazine. Those were both mediated by people like Rockler. So really the main botanical links were with the English nursery trade. The way that the material was sent to Britain was by ship. Obviously that was the only way, and it was in the form both of seeds, lots and lots of mentions of bags of seeds going to the nursery gardens, and sometimes the family members were allowed to keep some of the seeds for themselves and pass them around. But they were also sending living specimens. I mentioned the box with sandalwood, young sandalwood plants. It wasn't an easy matter, and it needed repeated sending. Some things would die at sea, sometimes cargoes got lost. But of course, this was the days before things like the Wardian case, which did hugely improve the rates of success from the mid-19th century onwards.
Right, thank you, Henry. That was very useful. The next question, a very good question, comes from Victoria, and it's to all panelists, but I am going to ask Henry to answer first, as I know he knows a great deal about this. Victoria says, "I am fascinated by the idea of flowers in chintz. Have there been any studies of the species painted in Palampur and textiles?"
This isn't really my area of expertise, and I would have to say that the plants depicted in the Palampurs are nearly all highly stylized. It's extremely rare to be able to recognize and put a scientific name on any of the beautifully stylized images that you get. But my interest is in the artists used by Roxburgh, and earlier used by a Frenchman at the turn of the 18th century, Nicolas Lempereur, in Orissa, who definitely used chintz painters. The fact that Roxburgh used them is speculation because of his trading interests in textiles, and the fact that he was based in the area of the Coromandel coast where major chintz production happened, and from the style of the drawing and painting itself, this drawing of strong outlines, very strong calligraphic element with the colouring in, which is why I picked up on that quotation that she talks about. And I did once actually go to visit chintz painters in today's India, in Sri Kalahasti, showed them in some of Roxburgh's drawings and said, would you be able to have done things like this? And they said, easily, yeah. And they were, of course, shown Western models of botanical illustration and came up with this hybrid style. But I would love to know if anyone can find any more concrete evidence of botanists recruiting chintz painters, but so that's still an open field.
Thank you, Henry. The next question is for John. John, the question starts by saying, thank you for this great response. And then, how did the professionalization of botany in the colonies after the 1830s relate to wider shifts in colonial attitudes towards indigenous knowledge, including botanical knowledge?
Yeah, thank you for this question, and I would like to answer it in two parts. So one was the shift in the attitudes towards indigenous knowledge systems, which happens sometimes from the 1830s at the end of the Anglicist Orientalist debate, which decisively ends in favor of the Anglicists. And this is also related in turn to a greater sense of security, establishment of the British felt, and more seriously taking their civilizing mission, and felt that there wasn't much to be learned. And also to be related is the move away from text, so to the greater engagement with the environment. And with regard to professionalization as such, so that also picks up once the colonial state itself gets going more professionally. But this happens more particularly after the company era ends and the crown era starts, post 1858. And of course, it goes to a zenith during the period of Curzon, when we see not only a greater professionalization, but also such professionalized, particularly botany, and in relation to agriculture, also being brought to bear on the state and its revenues.
Thank you for that, John. There's a question here from Tulika Gupta, and I think this is a question for Henry. She asks, and she means Elizabeth Gwillim. She says, she was in Madras. The language spoken there is Tamil, but she learned Telugu. Any particular reason to learn Telugu and not Tamil?
Well, of course, Telugu was extensively spoken in Madras as well as Tamil. Presumably it was certain social groups, and some of the artists certainly were Telugu speakers. But actually there's a wonderful comment in one of the letters, and unfortunately I haven't got it here, it's in the longer version of the paper, but she explicitly expresses a preference for the Telugu speaking people. She clearly thought Tamil speakers were more rustic, and I think one of the words, it wasn't genteel, but it was she talks about the Telugu speakers being neater and tidier, and she seemed to have an affinity with both those people and their language. But it is interesting, she could of course equally have, I mean, there are vast literatures in both languages. It seems to have been purely a personal taste, but I can send you the reference to that comment if you like.
Right. There's a question from Gina Douglas, and she asks, do we know what botanical books Elizabeth had access to?
Well, there's only one reference in her letters, and that's to the Thomas Martin edition of Miller's Gardener's Dictionary. And the only other reference to botanical books is she talks about a doctor who's just come down from the country who has lent her his botanical books. I speculate in the longer paper that it may have been Benjamin Heine who lent her his books, and of course he would have had a fantastic library of all the classic botanical works of the Linnaean period, but there are very few, well, no other references to what books she had, I'm afraid.
Right, thanks. There's a question from Sharida Ann, and Sharida Ann says, thank you for the illuminating talk. If time permits, could you comment on how the Indian artists and the local plant guides who helped these early pioneers fit into the new, more formalized field of botany that resulted in the late 18th, early 19th century, if at all?
Who wants to answer that? Shall I say something?
Yes, do, go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure that I can say much about that because, of course, all of this sort of information comes only from one side. It's from the Westerners. There's nothing in the words of the local people. So the only evidence is the sort of information that is recorded, and of course in the case of the botanical drawings by Indian artists, the work itself. But I would like to take issue with what John said about Lady Gwillim and her sister's attitude to Indian sources of information. They were truly exceptional in the credit they gave to local informants, and if that should have been apparent from my longer paper. And when he said that she made disparaging comments about the society of this place, the whole point, she was disparaging the local Europeans who she thought were very boring. They were only interested in things like horse racing. And again they stress how useful the gardeners and Indian servants were the only reliable sources of information about local plants.
Yeah, I agree with Henry on that, as I mentioned in my paper as well. So I've been informed that there are other letters which have better things to say. And in fact, on a side note, their dad, the judge, was himself dismissed because of the very progressive views he had and the support he gave to Indians, and for his condemnation of William Bentinck, who was governor here at Madras. So Sir William Gwillim spoke very much about the about what he called the autocratic spirit of what he was seeing around. So that is something to be noted. So they were the daughters of such a man, in fact. So he had to pack up and go home because of being dismissed for this kind of support for Indians and speaking against someone as high as William Bentinck. So I look forward to read those letters. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really very interesting. We have a general comment from Marika Sardar, which I'm going to read out, and she's responding to Victoria. She says, I have worked a bit on chintzes, and I'm also fascinated to hear this theory about those artists moving on to botanical painting. While there is a certain amount of stylization in their depiction, some plants can be identified, including cashews from the Americas, and then she kindly says that she can send on some references. We have a question from Jeffrey Spear, who asks, can you elaborate on the transmission of botanical knowledge by text and by practitioners of medicine as a non-Western tradition of learning? And I think the question's directed at both our speakers.
I'm not sure that I have anything to say about that. So John, can you comment, please?
No, I too don't think I have much to say on that. Sorry about that. So I think that's a good point to reflect on, to explore further. Thank you.
Right, okay. So on to the next one then. It's from Elza de Cruz, who says, thanks to the panel for the excellent papers. I have two questions. Telugu script and not Tamil script is mentioned to be present in a Lady Gwillim botanical painting. Has there been any mention in the letters about the regional ethnicities of the gardeners in Madras? That's her first question. And her second question is, during the professionalization phase, Professor John mentioned, were there any clashes between the Royal Horticultural Society and the Linnean Society?
Should I go first? She specifically says that she preferred the Telugu-speaking gardeners to the Tamil ones.
And anything from John about clashes between the Royal Horticultural Society and the Linnean Society during the phase of professionalization?
No, certainly not at this period, but perhaps at a later phase. Yeah, certainly not much in this period that we are talking about. Yeah.
Right, thanks. Two more questions. We have about 6 more minutes, so I am going to go ahead and ask these two questions. One is from Hannah Nichevich. I hope I said your name right. She says, hello, thanks for a great presentation. I have a quick question for Dr. Noltie. You mentioned Mary Simmons's fish paintings and how Anderson suggested that she have a native artist make copies of the works. I'm wondering if you might have any insight as to what the Urdu inscriptions on Simmons's fish might represent. Does it represent the writing of a native artist, the writing of a later collector? What do you think, Henry?
I'm afraid that I did start to think about that at one point when Victoria sent me some of those fish drawings, and I then got diverted, but I remember being very puzzled by them and not entirely being 100% convinced that they were the Mary Simmons fish drawings, because of course, as you suggest, it's very odd why there should be Urdu inscriptions on these drawings if they really were made in southern India. But someone who knows the fish taxonomy would hopefully be able to confirm where those drawings were made, because there would be huge regional differences between the fish occurring in different parts of the subcontinent. So no, that's an area that there needs to be a project on those fish drawings, but they were, I seem to remember there was some implication about their acquisition, about whether they actually came with at the same time as the bird drawings. I think they didn't. So there is some question hanging there.
Thank you. There's a question from Francisca Bray, and she says, the cosmopolitan circulation of plants between continents was principally seen by Banks and contemporaries as that of potentially useful plants. They had good potential which might or might not be realized. But was there also a sense of the risks involved in introducing plants to new environments that is conceptualized today as pests, invasive species, etc.? Either of you or both of you can take that question.
John, you go first.
Yeah, I do see there were instances like that, especially based on the early experiences in the Americas. And because I don't have particular names, but I've come across concerns about the possible dangers of introducing particular species. So one of the ones most famously discussed is prickly pears, of course, not in the Indian context, but of course, so I'm not in a position now to give particular names in the Indian context, but certainly there were concerns about invasive species, or what Francesca says, pests, what we call pests. Yeah, certainly they were there. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. I seem to have skipped a couple of questions, so I'm going to go back. There's a question from Serafina Masters, and she says, can John speak more to the social relationship between Elizabeth Gwillim and the native individuals who were known to have brought her the plant and bird samples for her studies? What degree of communication or valuation of knowledge may have been present? So 2 parts to the question.
Yeah, so actually that's the terrain of Henry, because he's the one who's been reading the letters, and I think that's probably Henry can take that, because I haven't had the opportunity of working on the letters as such. So still Henry was doing all that as of now in this domain. Yeah.
Well, I think we've actually already dealt with that question in another one about the problems of being one-sided information, very little from the Indians and a lot from the Brits.
Right. So I overlooked another question from Abdul Urfi, and I'm going to ask that question. It's a question for John. He says, you mentioned that Lady Gwillim observed in her letters that although the natives knew about the medicinal and curative properties of various plants, fruits and vegetables, they did not know anything about the underlying scientific reasons or mechanisms behind these. In what way does this indicate a colonial attitude? You mentioned somewhere that Lady Gwillim was a product of her times.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, certainly, of course, one wouldn't include Lady Gwillim in the mainstream of Orientalists, but she certainly seemed to have been influenced by some of those tropes. And as I mentioned, so this is what in many contexts is referred to as crude empiricism, dark empiricism, or even in some cases when they talk about smallpox, it's even called as criminal empiricism. So this is how they define the self in relation to the other. So confident of the emerging professionalization of botany in particular, and generally of other sciences, where they seem to be on surer grounds as far as theories, concepts, and other things are concerned. But Indians are still steeped in pure empiricism. Things work, cures work, they're efficacious, but they just don't know how they work. So that is definitely part of the one of the Orientalist tropes. Yeah.
Thank you, John.
Can I say something quickly about that?
Yes,
absolutely. I mean, it is fascinating that her reference to Culpeper, the 17th century botanist, who in his herbal always gives the name of the planet under which a plant is under the influence. And so she's sort of seeming to suggest perhaps that there's a sort of cultural evolution in people's understanding of medicinal uses of plants. And she's equating the Indian medicinal knowledge with that of Britain in the 17th century.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Unfortunately, we are now completely out of time. There are a couple more questions, and I hope the people who've asked them will send email messages to our speakers and communicate with them directly about that. So I'm going to stop the question and answer session right here. And over to you, Victoria.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's obvious by the questions that this has been a fascinating session for everyone. I certainly enjoyed it. So I want to thank everyone who attended for joining us for Gwillim Online. We'll look forward to welcoming you to our upcoming presentations. So we're returning this fall with 6 sessions on topics ranging from curry to climate change. So they'll follow on very nicely from this session on plants. Please mark your calendars for our next session on Tuesday, September the 29th at 9 a.m. Montreal time. Curry and clove beans, cooking, eating, and forgotten foods in early 19th century Madras. It will feature Professor Natalie Cook, a literary and culinary scholar and associate dean at the McGill Library, and Akash Muralidharan, architect and food designer from Chennai. It will deal, I think, with nostalgia and longing and the cultivation of exotics. I'll be moderating this discussion and I'm already salivating over their presentations. Merci de votre présence aujourd'hui, and we look forward to welcoming you again in 2 weeks' time to Gwillim Online. Thanks to everyone, and have a very good day and stay safe.